As long as I can remember, I've been writing songs, poems. I didn't call them songs when I was a kid. I called them song poems.
When Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, the flags of country music might as well have been lowered to half-mast. Radio stations across America pulled out his greatest recordings and played them on a loop. Fans gathered at memorials, leaving flowers, handwritten notes, and candles burning through the night. Newspapers ran full-page tributes. Fellow musicians described him as one of the most important voices in the history of American music. A man who gave dignity to the forgotten, who sang truth when others sang comfort. The world knew how to mourn Johnny Cash, because in many ways, the world felt like it knew him personally. His music had lived inside their homes, their cars, their most private moments. He was not just a celebrity, he was a companion. But while the world was grieving, another process was beginning. Quietly, behind the scenes, in the offices of estate attorneys and financial advisors, a plan that had been carefully constructed years before was now being executed with precision. Filing cabinets were opened. Trust documents were reviewed. Phone calls were made to record labels, publishing houses, and banks. And slowly, the shape of something most people never expected began to emerge. The fortune that Johnny Cash had spent nearly 5 decades building was not going where most people assumed it would go. There was no courtroom drama splashed across tabloid covers, at least not yet. No accusations of theft. No shocking secret relatives coming forward. What happened instead was far more subtle, and in many ways, far more revealing about the nature of success, family, and the decisions that powerful people make when they believe no one is watching. The story of where Johnny Cash's money went is not simply a story about money. It is a story about how a poor boy from rural Arkansas built an empire, how that empire changed the dynamics of everyone around him, and how, in the end, the official documents of a life can tell a very different story than the public image that preceded them. To truly understand the magnitude of what was at stake after Johnny Cash's death, you first have to understand how extraordinary his rise had been. He was not born into wealth or opportunity. He came into the world in 1932 in Kingsland, Arkansas, during a period of crushing national poverty. His parents were sharecroppers, farming land they did not own and keeping only a fraction of what they grew. The family was later relocated to Dyess, Arkansas, as part of a New Deal resettlement program, which offered them a modest wooden home and a plot of farmland to work. From a very young age, Johnny worked alongside his siblings in cotton fields under the hot southern sun. There was nothing glamorous about his childhood. Survival was the priority. Comfort was a luxury they rarely experienced. And yet, even in that environment of scarcity, music was always present. Gospel hymns echoed through the local church every Sunday. A radio in the family home brought distant voices into their world at night. Johnny absorbed everything: the sounds of faith, the expressions of sorrow, the rhythms of endurance. Long before he ever set foot on a stage, he was already developing the emotional vocabulary that would one day make him famous. Music was not an escape for him. It was simply the language that made the most sense. After high school, he joined the United States Air Force and was stationed in Germany. During his downtime, he sharpened his guitar skills and began writing songs with more seriousness. When he returned to America in the early 1950s, he headed straight for Memphis, which was at that time one of the most electrically charged cities in the musical universe. In 1954, he walked into Sun Records and asked for an audition. That audition changed the trajectory of his life and, in a very real sense, the trajectory of American music. His early recordings carried something that the polished, commercial sounds of the era did not: rawness, directness, and an emotional weight that felt earned rather than performed. Songs like "I Walk the Line" and "Cry, Cry, Cry" announced a new kind of voice. Within just a few years, the boy who had picked cotton for pennies was filling concert halls across the country. But early fame rarely translates into lasting financial security, and Johnny's situation in those early years was no exception. Sun Records was a small operation, and recording contracts of that era were notoriously tilted in favor of the label rather than the artist. The real financial turning point came in 1958 when he signed with Columbia Records. With a major label behind him, his reach expanded dramatically. Albums sold in greater volumes. Radio play generated publishing royalties. Because he wrote much of his own material, he also held the songwriting rights, a detail that would prove enormously significant for everything that came later. Throughout the 1960s, he was releasing multiple albums per year and performing hundreds of shows. Ticket sales, merchandise, endorsements, and appearance fees built a diversified income stream that few artists of his generation managed to construct. Then came television. The Johnny Cash Show premiered on ABC in 1969 and ran for 2 years, bringing him into the living rooms of millions of American families every single week. The exposure from that television program boosted record sales, attracted corporate sponsorships, and cemented his status not just as a musician but as a genuine cultural institution. By the early 1970s, he had become something more than a country music star. He was an entertainment empire. He toured internationally. He wrote autobiographies. He appeared in films and television dramas. His name was a brand, and that brand generated money from multiple directions simultaneously. The 1970s and early 1980s brought challenges. Changing musical trends pushed traditional country acts toward the margins. His personal struggles with addiction and health complicated his professional life. For a time, it seemed as though the peak might be behind him. But Johnny Cash was never a straightforward story, and just when the narrative seemed to be winding down, it took one of the most remarkable turns in music history. In the early 1990s, producer Rick Rubin approached him with a deceptively simple idea. Strip away everything, the band, the production, the polish, and record songs in their most intimate, unadorned form. The result was the American Recording Series, a collection of albums that stunned critics and introduced him to an entirely new generation of listeners. His cover of the Nine Inch Nails song Hurt became iconic in a way that transcended genre. The accompanying music video, filmed when he was visibly aging and frail, felt less like a promotional clip and more like a profound artistic statement about mortality and legacy. A new wave of fans who had never owned a Johnny Cash record suddenly could not stop listening to him. The commercial revival transformed the financial value of everything he had ever recorded. His entire back catalog surged in value. Publishing rights, master recordings, licensing agreements, and branding opportunities coalesced into an intellectual property portfolio of enormous worth. Industry analysts at the time of his death estimated the total value of his estate somewhere between tens of millions and nearly $100 million, depending on how the music catalog was valued. The sharecropper's son had built one of the most financially significant artistic legacies in American music history. To most people who followed Johnny Cash's life, his family story was as familiar as his music. The public narrative centered on one of the great love stories in country music history, the relationship between Johnny and June Carter Cash. They had met through the world of touring and recording, fallen into a complicated and dramatic attraction that played out over years before they finally married in 1968, and then built what appeared to be an extraordinary partnership. They performed together. They raised a family together. They stood at each other's sides through personal crises and professional triumphs. Fans loved them as a couple the way people love a great story, not just for what it was, but for what it represented. Redemption, devotion, second chances. But the public picture, beautiful as it was, contained layers that most people never saw clearly. Before June, there was Vivian Liberto. Johnny had met Vivian in 1951 while stationed at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. They fell in love and maintained a long-distance relationship through thousands of handwritten letters while he was deployed overseas. They married in 1954, the same year he first walked into Sun Records. At that point, he was not a star. He was a young man with a guitar, a steady determination, and no guarantee of anything. Vivian stood beside the version of him that existed before the world decided he was extraordinary. As his fame exploded, the marriage came under enormous strain. Vivian was left at home in California with their 4 daughters, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, and Tara. While Johnny was consumed by touring, recording, and a deepening addiction to amphetamines and alcohol. The lifestyle of the road pulled him further from his family with each passing year. By the time his divorce from Vivian was finalized in 1966, they had spent more time apart than together. She had tried to hold together a marriage to a man who, in many ways, had already become someone else entirely. June Carter came from a completely different world. She was country music royalty, a member of the Carter family, the dynasty that had helped define American folk and country music in the previous generation. By the time she and Johnny became romantically involved, she was already a seasoned professional who had navigated the entertainment industry for decades. She had also been married twice before, first to country singer Carl Smith, with whom she had a daughter named Carlene, and then to Edwin "Rip" Nix, with whom she had another daughter named Rosie. She understood the music industry in ways that Vivian never had, and that shared fluency in the language of performance and business created a bond between June and Johnny that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. When they married in 1968, June stepped into a role that was part wife, part creative partner, part manager, and part anchor. She reportedly helped him through his initial withdrawal from pills. She traveled with him on the road. She participated in recording sessions. She collaborated on songwriting. Over time, she became deeply embedded not just in his personal life but in the business operations surrounding his career. She managed communications. She influenced creative decisions. She helped navigate relationships with record labels and industry figures. As his health declined in the later years of his life, her influence over business and financial matters deepened further. Together, they had one son, born in 1970 and named John Carter Cash. He was the only child the two of them shared, and from a very early stage, he occupied a unique position in the family structure. He had grown up entirely within the era of the legend, not during the struggles that preceded it. He was raised inside the music industry. He understood its workings. He developed his own career as a record producer and musician. He was, in many visible and invisible ways, being shaped into the person who would one day carry the family enterprise forward. Meanwhile, Johnny's 4 daughters from his marriage to Vivian grew up in a different emotional reality. They had known their father before the mythology solidified around him. They remembered the man who was still becoming Johnny Cash, the father who wrote letters from the road and who carried the weight of personal demons alongside the weight of his talent. For them, June Carter was not simply a stepmother. She was also, in the context of their family history, the person whose relationship with their father had coincided with the collapse of their parents' marriage. Whatever the personal relationships were, and by all accounts they contained genuine warmth at times, the emotional architecture was far more complicated than the public ever knew. And it was inside that complicated architecture that the plans for Johnny Cash's fortune were quietly being made. When June Carter Cash died in May 2003, Johnny was devastated. By virtually every account, her death broke something in him that could not be repaired. He was already dealing with serious health issues, including diabetes and autonomic neuropathy. After June passed, he threw himself into his work with what many described as a quiet, deliberate urgency. He recorded more music. He gave interviews. He seemed, in some sense, to be finishing something. He died just 4 months later, in September of that same year. The closeness of those 2 deaths, husband and wife, within the same calendar year, meant that legal and financial plans that might otherwise have unfolded gradually instead executed almost simultaneously. The estate attorneys had documents ready. The trust structures were already in place. And what those documents revealed, as they became known to the family and then eventually to broader public awareness, was not what most people had imagined. Johnny Cash had utilized what is known as a revocable trust, a legal tool that allows wealthy individuals to transfer assets after death without going through the public process of probate court. Because the trust bypassed probate, many of the specific details remained private. But the broad outlines eventually became known. The 4 daughters from his first marriage each received a financial bequest, reports indicated approximately $1 million each, which acknowledged them as his children and provided them with a meaningful inheritance. But the core of the empire was not divided equally among all 5 children. The publishing interests, the rights to his name and likeness, the authority over his archival recordings, and the stewardship of the broader Cash business enterprise were consolidated and directed primarily toward John Carter Cash. As the only child born to both Johnny and June, and as someone who had already been working professionally within the music industry, John Carter was positioned as the primary executor of the estate and the principal heir to its ongoing commercial operations. The reasoning, from a purely practical business standpoint, had a certain internal logic. Music catalogs of the magnitude that Johnny had built are not static assets. They require active, ongoing management. Licensing decisions must be made. Archival projects must be developed. Commercial proposals must be evaluated and either accepted or rejected. The question of whether a particular advertiser should be allowed to use a song in their campaign, or whether a particular film studio should be granted the rights to portray his life on screen, requires judgment, taste, and a clear understanding of how decisions today will affect the legacy decades from now. Having a single decision-maker, the argument would go, protects the integrity of the catalog better than dividing authority among 5 people who might disagree. But for the daughters, the outcome was difficult to process. Each of them had spent their lives as Johnny Cash's children. They had lived in his shadow and in his light. They had watched his struggles and celebrated his triumphs. They carried his name and his blood. And now, as the commercial engine of his legacy generated royalties that would compound for decades and likely centuries, they found themselves on the outside of a conversation about how that engine would run. For several years after the deaths of Johnny and June, the family maintained at least a surface-level peace. Grief was real. Tributes were genuine. The world mourned together, and whatever tensions existed within the family remained largely private. But by 2007, those tensions had reached a breaking point that moved them into a federal courtroom. The lawsuit initiated by Johnny's 4 daughters targeted one of the most recognizable songs in American music history, Ring of Fire. The legal argument centered on copyright renewal rights, a provision within United States copyright law that allows heirs to reclaim certain ownership interests in creative works after a specified period of time. The daughters argued that as Johnny Cash's biological heirs, they were entitled to a portion of the copyright renewal rights for a song so completely associated with their father that it had become inseparable from his identity. It was a legally creative argument, and it reflected the depth of their frustration. Ring of Fire was not just a song in the catalog. It was, for many people, the defining musical signature of Johnny Cash's entire career. Its rolling horn arrangement, its volcanic imagery, its declaration of love as something consuming and uncontrollable. These things had entered the collective cultural memory tied directly to his voice and his name. But the defense team, representing the interests overseen by John Carter Cash, presented a counter-argument that proved legally decisive. Ring of Fire had not been written solely by Johnny Cash. The song was co-written by June Carter Cash and Merle Kilgore. As the primary composer on record, the song's publishing rights belonged to June Carter Cash. When June died in May 2003, her assets, including her ownership stake in Ring of Fire, passed first to her husband Johnny and then, upon Johnny's death 4 months later, to John Carter Cash as her heir. The chain of legal ownership flowed entirely through June's estate, not Johnny's. In 2009, a federal judge issued a ruling that delivered a decisive blow to the daughters' case. The court determined not only that their legal claim lacked merit but questioned their standing to bring the suit at all. Because the copyright in question was categorized as June Carter Cash's intellectual property, Johnny's children from his marriage to Vivian had no legal basis to claim ownership of it, regardless of how closely the song was associated with their father's public identity. The emotional and cultural connection between Johnny Cash and Ring of Fire was undeniable. The legal connection between his daughters and the song's copyright was non-existent. The ruling effectively closed the door on any realistic prospect of the daughters gaining meaningful ownership stakes in the ongoing commercial operations of the Cash empire. It was a watershed moment that clarified the boundary between emotional legacy and legal inheritance in terms that could not be appealed away. The years following the 2009 dismissal brought a gradual, imperfect settling into a new reality. The courtroom battles ended. The public accusations faded. What replaced them was something quieter and more complicated. A family navigating the strange landscape of loving a shared legacy while being formally separated from its management. John Carter Cash moved forward as the executor and primary steward of his parents' combined artistic estate. The decisions that flowed from that position were significant. When the biographical film Walk the Line was released in 2005, it introduced Johnny's life story to a massive mainstream audience that included millions of younger viewers who had grown up well after his peak years. The film, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon, earned awards recognition and drove enormous renewed interest in the original recordings. Streaming numbers surged. Back catalog sales climbed. The estate benefited substantially from the attention. Beyond the film, ongoing licensing decisions for commercials, films, television programs, and streaming platforms continued to generate revenue that compounded over time. The Johnny Cash Museum, established in Nashville, became a cultural destination that attracted visitors from around the world. Archival recording projects brought previously unreleased material to audiences hungry for more. Each anniversary, each tribute concert, each new generation of listeners discovering Hurt or Folsom Prison Blues, for the first time added to the commercial value of a catalog that showed no signs of diminishing. For the daughters, the emotional cost of their exclusion from these developments was real and lasting. Rosanne Cash, herself a successful recording artist and the most publicly vocal of the four sisters, has spoken in various interviews about the difficulty of watching her father's image function as a commercial brand in which she holds no ownership stake. She has not accused her brother of bad faith. She has not portrayed the outcome as a theft or a conspiracy. Instead, she has described something more nuanced and perhaps more painful: the sense of being a spectator to your own family's history, of watching your father's name and voice and face generate wealth and cultural influence while being formally disconnected from the decisions that shape how those things are used. At the same time, she and her sisters have spoken of maintaining their love for Johnny Cash the father, separate from their complicated feelings about the estate structure. The personal memories, of his voice in their childhood home, of road trips and holiday gatherings, of a man who despite his flaws was unmistakably their father, remain theirs entirely. No legal document can reach into those. John Carter Cash, for his part, has consistently described his role as one of obligation and devotion rather than ownership for its own sake. He has spoken about the responsibility he feels to protect his parents' legacy from exploitation, to ensure that the work they created together continues to be presented with the care and integrity it deserves. From his perspective, centralized management is not exclusion but stewardship. Both perspectives contain truth. That is what makes the story so difficult to resolve neatly. The family, by most available accounts, has reached something resembling an uneasy peace. Full reconciliation may be too strong a word, but open warfare has clearly ended. Major projects connected to the Cash legacy sometimes involve consultations with multiple family members, even when there is no legal requirement to do so. The restoration of Johnny Cash's childhood home in Dyess, Arkansas, has been one project that appears to have united different branches of the family around a common purpose: preserving the physical memory of where it all began. But the gatherings are often separate. The involvement is often uneven. The legal architecture that Johnny and June constructed, with the best of intentions and with sound legal counsel, created boundaries that continue to shape the family's experience of their shared history. The story of Johnny Cash's fortune is not, in the end, a story about greed or betrayal. No one in this narrative is a villain. The estate plan was legal. The decisions were deliberate. The outcome, however unexpected it felt to outsiders, reflected choices that Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash made in full awareness of what they were doing. What the story really illuminates is something broader and more universal. When a person builds something of enormous value, the question of what happens to it after they are gone rarely has a simple, universally satisfying answer. Blood relationships and legal relationships do not always align. Emotional closeness and legal inheritance are not the same thing. The child who is most involved in the day-to-day operations of a family enterprise is not automatically the child who is loved the most, but they are frequently the child who ends up with the most formal authority over what happens next. Johnny Cash's wealth was not simply money in a bank account. It was a living, breathing collection of intellectual property that would continue generating income and cultural influence long after its creator was gone. Managing that collection required someone with the knowledge, the relationships, and the legal authority to make decisions in real time. The estate plan provided exactly that kind of clarity, and it provided it at the cost of the broader family's equal participation. There is also something significant in the timing. June died in May 2003. Johnny died in September 2003. The closeness of those deaths meant that a transition that might have unfolded slowly, with time for family conversations,